Some crimes don't announce themselves with chaos or violence visible to the world. Some slip into a community quietly, like fog settling over a valley at dawn. And sometimes, the person responsible is the last one anyone would ever suspect. This is a story about trust, and what happens when it's weaponized. About a young woman whose life was stolen in a place she thought was safe. And about the decades it took for one overlooked detail, one fragment of truth buried beneath years of certainty, to finally surface and change everything. This happened in Cookeville, Tennessee. A small city tucked into the Upper Cumberland region, where everyone knew their neighbors and strangers were noticed. In 1988, it was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked. Where a handshake meant something. Where the idea that evil could live among them, wearing a familiar face, felt impossible. But it did. And the person who took her life? He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He wasn't a drifter passing through town. He wasn't someone people whispered about with suspicion. He was standing in plain sight, trusted by nearly everyone who knew him. For 24 years, the truth stayed buried. But in 2012, that would finally change. Before we go any further, take a second to subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far these stories reach. Now, let me ask you something. If someone you trusted completely, someone you saw every day, someone who had access to your life, your routine, your vulnerabilities, if that person decided to harm you, how long would it take for anyone to even suspect them? How many years would pass before the truth broke through the wall of trust they'd built around themselves? That's the question at the heart of this case. Her name was Angela Renee Sisk. 28 years old. Born and raised in Tennessee, she had the kind of presence people remembered, not because she demanded attention, but because she gave it so freely to others. She worked as a nursing assistant at a healthcare facility in Cookeville, a job that required patience, compassion, and an ability to connect with people at their most vulnerable. And Angela was good at it. Her coworkers described her as warm, dependable, someone who took the work seriously but never lost her sense of humor. She wasn't trying to save the world. She was just trying to show up and do right by the people in her care. Outside of work, Angela lived a relatively quiet life. She had family in the area, friends who cared about her, routines that gave her days structure and meaning. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't the kind of person who put herself in dangerous situations. She wasn't living on the edge or making choices that invited trouble into her life. She moved through her world the way most people do, believing that if you worked hard, treated people well, and stayed out of trouble, you'd be okay. She had dreams, the way everyone does at 28. Plans that extended beyond the immediate present. Maybe she thought about advancing in her career, about taking on more responsibility, about making a real difference in the lives of the people she cared for. Maybe she thought about finding someone to build a life with, about starting a family of her own someday. Maybe she had simpler dreams, a better apartment, a vacation she'd been saving for, small pleasures that would make her daily life a little brighter. We'll never know what those dreams were, not really. Because they were stolen from her before she had a chance to pursue them. But safety, it turns out, isn't something you earn. Sometimes it's just something you lose. It was early autumn in 1988 when Angela Renee Sisk disappeared. The exact details of her final hours aren't the kind of thing you can reconstruct with certainty after so much time has passed, but what we do know is this: she was last seen leaving work. Her shift had ended. She said goodbye to her coworkers the way she always did, probably thinking about what she'd make for dinner, or whether she needed to stop at the store on the way home. Ordinary thoughts. The kind that fill your mind when you have no reason to believe anything is wrong. The facility where Angela worked was the kind of place where everyone knew each other. It wasn't a massive hospital with hundreds of staff members passing through sterile corridors without making eye contact. It was smaller, more personal. The kind of workplace where you knew who took their coffee black, who was planning a birthday party for their kid, who was going through a rough patch and needed a kind word. Angela was part of that fabric. She belonged there, not just as an employee, but as someone people genuinely liked having around. When her shift ended that day, she walked out into the parking lot the way she'd done hundreds of times before. The air was starting to cool, the way it does in Tennessee when summer finally loosens its grip and autumn begins to settle in. It was the kind of evening where you might notice the changing light, the way the shadows fell a little differently than they had a month before. The kind of evening that feels peaceful, unremarkable. She never made it home. At first, her absence didn't set off alarms. Angela was an adult. She had her own life. Maybe she'd gone to visit a friend. Maybe she'd decided to stay somewhere overnight without calling ahead. It wasn't unusual for someone to be out of touch for a day or two in 1988, especially before cell phones became ubiquitous. Communication was different then. You couldn't just send a quick text to let someone know where you were. You had to find a phone, make a call, hope someone was home to answer. And if you didn't, well, people learned to live with temporary periods of not knowing. But when a full day passed, and then another, and Angela still hadn't turned up, the people who loved her began to feel that familiar, creeping dread. The kind that starts in your stomach and works its way up into your chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think about anything else. The kind that whispers that something is very, very wrong. Her family reported her missing. They went to the Cookeville Police Department, explained that Angela hadn't come home, hadn't called, hadn't shown up for her next shift at work. They tried to keep their voices steady, tried not to let panic seep into their words, but the fear was there. You could hear it in the pauses between sentences, in the way they kept repeating details as if saying them again might somehow make Angela reappear. Local authorities began asking questions, retracing her last known movements, trying to piece together what had happened. They spoke to her co-workers, her friends, anyone who might have seen her that day. And what they found was nothing. No signs of struggle. No evidence of foul play in her apartment. No angry ex-boyfriend lurking in the background. No financial trouble that might have motivated her to disappear voluntarily. No secret life that might explain why she'd vanished. Angela was just gone. For a small community like Cookeville, that kind of uncertainty was unbearable. People wanted answers. They wanted to believe that Angela had simply left town for reasons of her own, that she'd turn up safe and sound with an explanation that would make everyone laugh with relief. Maybe she'd met someone. Maybe she'd decided on a whim to take a trip. Maybe there was some perfectly reasonable explanation that would make all this worry seem silly in retrospect. But deep down, most of them knew better. Women didn't just disappear like that. Not without a reason. Not without leaving some kind of trace, some clue about where they'd gone or why. The longer Angela stayed missing, the more the community's hope curdled into something darker. Something nobody wanted to name out loud, but everyone was thinking. And then, a few days later, her body was found. She'd been strangled. Left in a location not far from where she'd last been seen, discarded in a way that suggested whoever killed her had wanted to hide what they'd done, but hadn't gone to extraordinary lengths to do so. It was as if the killer believed they wouldn't need to. As if they thought they were safe. As if they assumed that nobody would ever connect them to Angela's death. The discovery sent a wave of shock and grief through Cookeville that was almost physical in its intensity. Angela wasn't just another name in the news, another statistic in a crime report. She was someone's daughter. Someone's coworker. Someone people saw at the grocery store, at church, around town. Her death wasn't an abstraction. It was a wound torn straight through the fabric of the community. People who'd known her struggled to process what had happened. They kept expecting to see her at work, kept forgetting for brief moments that she was gone, and then remembering again with a fresh stab of grief. They found themselves looking over their shoulders in parking lots, locking their doors at night when they never had before, wondering if they were safe in a town they'd always considered home. And almost immediately, the question everyone asked was the same: who could have done this? The investigation began in earnest. Detectives with the Cookeville Police Department and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation started running down every lead they could find. They interviewed anyone who'd been in contact with Angela in the days before her death. They looked at her personal life, her work life, her relationships. They asked hard questions, the kind that make people uncomfortable but are necessary when you're trying to find a killer. They wanted to know if Angela had been seeing anyone romantically. If she'd had any conflicts with anyone at work. If anyone had been paying unwanted attention to her. If she'd mentioned feeling unsafe or worried about anything. They cast a wide net, because at that stage of an investigation, you can't afford to rule anything out. Her co-workers were interviewed extensively. Everyone who'd been working that day was asked about their interactions with Angela, about whether they'd noticed anything unusual, about whether anyone had seemed particularly interested in her or had behaved strangely. The interviews were thorough, sometimes lasting hours, as detectives tried to build a complete picture of Angela's final day. Her family was interviewed too, though not as suspects, as sources of information about Angela's life, her habits, her concerns. They did their best to help, to provide any detail that might matter, even as they were drowning in their own grief. It's a cruel thing, to lose someone you love and then immediately have to catalog the details of their life for strangers, to answer questions about their relationships and routines when all you want is to collapse under the weight of what's happened. The forensic evidence collected from the scene was limited by the standards of what would be possible even a decade later. This was 1988. DNA analysis was in its infancy, not yet the powerful tool it would become. There were no surveillance cameras to review, no cell phone records to pull, no digital footprint to follow. The investigators had to rely on physical evidence, witness statements, and old-fashioned detective work. They processed what they could. Documented everything. Took photographs. Collected samples. But the reality was that they didn't have much to work with. The scene where Angela's body was found didn't tell them much about who'd killed her. There were no clear signs pointing to a specific individual. No obvious physical evidence that could be definitively linked to a suspect. And the more they investigated, the more frustrated they became. Because nothing added up to a clear picture. They looked at Angela's personal life first, the way investigators always do. Was there an ex-boyfriend with a history of violence? A rejected suitor who couldn't take no for an answer? A jealous coworker? But every avenue they explored led nowhere. Angela had been single at the time of her death. There was no bitter ex lurking in the background. No one who fit the profile of someone who might have wanted to harm her. They expanded their search, looking at anyone who might have crossed paths with her that day. Delivery drivers. Maintenance workers. People who'd been in the parking lot when she left work. But again, nothing. No one stood out as suspicious. No one had a clear motive. No one seemed out of place in the landscape of Angela's ordinary life. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The initial surge of investigative energy began to slow, not because the detectives stopped caring, but because they'd exhausted their leads. They'd interviewed everyone they could find. They'd followed every thread they could pull. And they still didn't have a suspect. The case file grew thicker with reports and statements and dead ends. The detectives working Angela's case would review the evidence again and again, hoping to spot something they'd missed, some detail that would suddenly make sense and point them in the right direction. But it never came. And slowly, inevitably, the case began to go cold. It wasn't for lack of effort. The detectives working Angela's case didn't just give up and move on. They kept her file active. They continued to follow up on tips that came in, though those tips grew less frequent as time passed. They revisited the evidence periodically, hoping that new forensic techniques or a fresh perspective might reveal something they'd missed. But without new leads, without witnesses, without a clear direction to follow, there's only so much you can do. Active investigations demand attention and resources. When a case goes months without progress, those resources have to be redirected to newer cases, fresher leads, crimes that might still be solvable. The case remained open, technically, but it faded from the front of people's minds. Life moved forward, the way it always does, even when you wish it wouldn't. New crimes happened. New victims needed advocates. The daily machinery of law enforcement ground on, and Angela's case became one file among many, waiting for something, anything, that might breathe new life into it. But for Angela's family, there was no moving forward. There was only the silence. The not knowing. The unbearable weight of a question that would hang over them for the next 24 years, who took her from us? In the years that followed Angela's death, Cookeville changed in the way all small towns do. New businesses opened. Old ones closed. People moved away. New families moved in. Children grew up, graduated from high school, went off to college or stayed to build lives in the place they'd always known. The town's population shifted and aged. The world outside kept changing, technology advanced, culture evolved, entire ways of living transformed. The memory of what happened to Angela Renee Sisk didn't disappear, exactly, but it receded into the background, becoming part of the town's history rather than its present. Older residents remembered. They'd think of her from time to time, usually when another case made the news, and they'd wonder quietly if anyone was still looking for answers. Some of them would drive past the healthcare facility where she'd worked and feel a pang of sadness, remembering the young woman who died for reasons nobody could explain. But to most people, especially those who'd moved to Cookeville after 1988 or who'd been too young to remember when it happened, Angela's case was a tragedy from another era. Something that had happened before they arrived, or when they were too young to understand. A name on a list of unsolved cases that grew longer with each passing year. Her family, though, they couldn't forget. They couldn't move on. Grief is strange that way. It doesn't follow a timeline or respect other people's expectations about when you should be over it. For Angela's mother, her father, her siblings, every holiday was a reminder of who wasn't there. Every birthday that passed was another year Angela would never see. Every time they heard about another unsolved case, they'd wonder if the same thing was happening to another family, if someone else was living through the same nightmare of not knowing. They'd pushed for answers in those early years. Made calls to the police department. Asked if there were any new developments. Provided whatever information they could, hoping that something they remembered might suddenly matter in a way it hadn't before. But as the years stretched on and no answers came, that pushing became harder. Not because they cared less, but because the disappointment of hearing no new leads over and over again was its own kind of torture. So they learned to live with the uncertainty. They had no choice. They built their lives around the absence, the way you build around a missing tooth, your tongue constantly finding its way to the gap, unable to forget what used to be there. What no one realized, what no one could have realized at the time, was that the person responsible for her death hadn't left town. Hadn't gone into hiding. Hadn't spent the last 2 decades looking over his shoulder, waiting for the moment when everything would unravel. He'd simply continued living his life. Right there in Cookeville. Visible. Trusted. Unquestioned. To understand how that's possible, you have to understand something fundamental about human nature and the way we process information about the people around us. We assume that people who do terrible things will look like monsters. That they'll behave in ways that mark them as dangerous, that set them apart from the rest of us. We believe that if we pay attention, we'll see the signs, the coldness in their eyes, the cruelty in their words, the disregard for others that signals something broken inside them. And when we don't see those signs, we convince ourselves that the person in front of us must be innocent. Because how could someone we know, someone we trust, someone we work with, someone we see at the grocery store, be capable of something so horrific? That assumption protects us, psychologically. It allows us to move through the world without constant fear, without viewing every interaction as potentially dangerous. It lets us trust our neighbors, our coworkers, the people we encounter in our daily lives. Without that ability to trust, social life would become impossible. We'd be paralyzed by suspicion. But it also creates a kind of blindness. A refusal to see what's right in front of us, because seeing it would shatter too much of what we believe to be true about the world and our place in it. And in this case, that blindness lasted for more than 2 decades. The detectives who'd worked Angela's case in 1988 hadn't forgotten about her. Many of them had moved on to other assignments over the years. Some had retired, taking with them the institutional knowledge and the personal connection to cases they'd worked. But the case file remained. Tucked away in storage, gathering dust but never quite disappearing. Every few years, someone would pull it out, review the evidence, see if there was anything they'd missed. They'd run the case through their minds again, testing old theories, looking for new angles, hoping that something would click into place. But nothing changed. The evidence was what it was. The witness statements were decades old, the memories they contained already fading when they were given and now ancient. The people who'd been interviewed in 1988 had scattered, moved away, passed on. Some had lost interest in the case, either because they'd never really been invested or because the passage of time had dulled whatever connection they'd felt. The case felt frozen in time, impossible to move forward, impossible to let go. Cold cases are strange that way. They exist in a kind of limbo, neither solved nor entirely abandoned. They represent failure, in a sense, the failure to achieve justice when the trail was fresh, when witnesses were available, when evidence was new. But they also represent hope. The hope that someday, somehow, something will change. A new witness will come forward. A new technology will make old evidence relevant again. A suspect will make a mistake, say the wrong thing, leave a trace that finally leads investigators to the truth. For most cold cases, that hope is never realized. They remain unsolved indefinitely, until everyone involved is dead and the case becomes nothing more than a historical curiosity. But sometimes, not often, but sometimes, something does change. And then, in the early 2010s, something shifted in Angela's case. It wasn't a dramatic breakthrough. It wasn't a confession that fell from the sky. It wasn't even new evidence, not in the traditional sense. What changed was perspective. The willingness to question assumptions that had been accepted as fact for more than 20 years. One of the investigators assigned to review cold cases in Tennessee began looking at Angela's file with fresh eyes. Not because they had new information, but because they were willing to consider possibilities that earlier investigators had dismissed. They started asking different questions. Not just, who could have done this, but, who did we assume couldn't have done this? That second question is more powerful than it might seem at first. Because in every investigation, there are people who get ruled out early, not because the evidence definitively clears them, but because they don't fit the profile of someone who would commit the crime. They're too cooperative. Too helpful. Too normal. They pass the informal test of seeming like a good person, and once they pass that test, they often stop being scrutinized. But what if that's exactly what allows some killers to hide in plain sight? What if the very qualities that make someone seem trustworthy, cooperativeness, helpfulness, normalcy, are the same qualities they use as camouflage? The investigator reviewing Angela's case started from that premise. They went back through the list of everyone who'd been interviewed in 1988, and instead of asking, did this person seem suspicious, they asked, did this person have opportunity? Did they have access to Angela? Could they have done this, regardless of whether they seemed like the type? And that's when a name surfaced. Someone who'd been part of the investigation from the very beginning. Not as a suspect, but as a witness. Someone who'd been close to Angela. Someone who'd had access to her, who knew her routines, who could have crossed paths with her on the day she disappeared without anyone thinking twice about it. Someone who, on paper, should have been looked at more closely, but never was. Because he was trusted. Because he was helpful. Because he was one of the people trying to solve the case. What the investigators began to realize, slowly and with growing certainty, was that the person who killed Angela Renee Sisk had been hiding in the one place no one thought to look, among the people who cared about her. Let me take a step back for a moment. Right now, as this story unfolds, what time is it where you're listening from? I ask because time is strange when you're talking about a case like this. For Angela's family, the last 24 years must have felt like an eternity. Every holiday without answers. Every birthday that passed. Every moment they saw someone who reminded them of her, a young woman with Angela's laugh, or her walk, or the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. Time doesn't heal wounds like that, it just teaches you how to live with them, how to get up in the morning and go through the motions even when part of you is still trapped in 1988, waiting for a phone call that will never come. But for the person responsible, time must have felt entirely different. Every year that passed without consequences was another year of safety. Another year to believe he'd gotten away with it. Another year to build a life on top of a lie. I wonder if he thought about her. If guilt kept him up at night, or if he'd managed to compartmentalize what he'd done, sealing it off in some dark corner of his mind where it couldn't touch his daily life. I wonder if he felt relief each year when the anniversary passed without incident, or if he'd stopped thinking about it entirely, confident that he was in the clear. The re-examination of Angela's case in 2012 didn't happen because of a single piece of evidence. It happened because someone decided to treat the case as if it were still solvable. As if the passage of time didn't mean the truth was lost forever. As if Angela's life still mattered enough to warrant another look, another round of questions, another attempt at justice. The investigator who'd pulled Angela's file began reviewing everything from the beginning. The witness statements. The timeline of her last known day. The list of people who'd been in Angela's life at the time of her death. The physical evidence, limited as it was. The theories that had been pursued and abandoned. The leads that had gone nowhere. And one name kept coming up, over and over again, in ways that felt significant once you stopped assuming he was innocent. His name was Kenneth Bartley. He was a co-worker of Angela's at the healthcare facility where she worked. He'd known her well. Seen her nearly every day. Been part of her routine, her world, the background of her daily life. He wasn't her closest friend, but he wasn't a stranger either. He occupied that middle ground of familiarity, someone you'd greet in the hallway, chat with during breaks, work alongside without thinking much about it. And when she disappeared, he'd been one of the people interviewed by police. He'd answered their questions. Told them what he knew. Expressed concern for her safety. He'd seemed worried, genuinely upset that something had happened to someone he knew. He'd been cooperative throughout the process, providing whatever information he could, never once acting like he had something to hide. He'd seemed helpful. Normal. Exactly like someone who had nothing to do with Angela's disappearance would seem. And because of that, he'd never been seriously considered as a suspect. In 1988, that made sense. The detectives working the case had limited resources and limited time. They couldn't investigate everyone with the same level of scrutiny. They had to make judgments about who seemed worth a deeper look and who could be safely ruled out. And Bartley, cooperative and concerned, hadn't raised any red flags. But now, looking back with the knowledge that someone close to Angela had likely been responsible, Bartley's proximity to her started to look different. Not conclusive. Not proof. But worth a second look. The investigators began digging into his background more thoroughly than had been done in 1988. They reviewed his statements from back then, looking for inconsistencies, gaps, anything that might have been missed the first time around. They interviewed people who'd known him back then, asking questions about his behavior, his relationships, his temperament. They were careful. Methodical. They knew that after 24 years, memory was unreliable, and accusations without evidence could destroy an innocent person's life. But the more they looked, the more things didn't add up. Bartley had told police in 1988 that he'd last seen Angela at work, that she'd seemed fine, that he had no idea what might have happened to her after she left. And that had been accepted at face value. Why wouldn't it be? He was a co-worker. A familiar face. Someone who had no apparent reason to harm her. Someone who seemed genuinely shocked and saddened by her death. But when investigators looked more closely at the timeline now, they found inconsistencies. Small ones, the kind that might not have seemed important in 1988 but became significant in hindsight. Questions about where exactly he'd been that evening. Who he'd been with. Why certain details in his story didn't quite line up with what others remembered. In 1988, those inconsistencies had been dismissed as normal variations in memory. Different people remember things differently. Witnesses contradict each other all the time without it meaning anything sinister. Under the stress of an investigation, it's easy to get details confused, to misremember the order of events or the exact timing of things. But now, viewed through the lens of suspicion rather than trust, those same inconsistencies look different. They look like the kind of small mistake someone makes when they're trying to construct a false narrative. When they're trying to remember not what actually happened, but what they said happened. The investigators also started looking more closely at the relationship between Bartley and Angela. In 1988, they'd established that they were co-workers, that they knew each other, that there was no obvious conflict between them. But they hadn't dug much deeper than that. They hadn't asked the more uncomfortable questions about whether there might have been tension between them, whether Bartley might have wanted something from Angela that she wasn't willing to give. Now, speaking to people who'd worked alongside both of them, a different picture began to emerge. Suggestions that Bartley had been interested in Angela in ways that went beyond friendly coworker interactions. That he'd asked her out, maybe more than once. That she'd declined, politely at first and then more firmly when he didn't take the hint. That he hadn't handled the rejection well. None of this was definitive. These were second-hand accounts from people trying to remember dynamics from more than 2 decades ago. Memories that had been shaped and reshaped over time, possibly influenced by the knowledge that Angela had been murdered and the natural human tendency to retrofit past events to make sense of present tragedies. But it was enough to establish a possible motive. A reason why Bartley might have wanted to harm Angela. Rejection. Humiliation. The toxic combination of wounded pride and thwarted desire that has motivated countless acts of violence, particularly violence against women. The investigators knew they needed more than this. They needed something concrete, something that could withstand scrutiny, something that could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Kenneth Bartley had killed Angela Renee Sisk. What they had was circumstantial. Behavioral. Based on inconsistencies and suspicions that had taken decades to surface. But sometimes, that's where you start. You follow the thread, even when you can't see where it leads, because the alternative is letting the truth stay buried forever. And in this case, the thread led them back to Bartley's own words. They decided to re-interview him. To approach him not as a witness who might have useful information, but as someone who needed to explain the inconsistencies in his previous statements. Someone who needed to account for the gaps in his story. When they contacted him, Bartley agreed to talk. Why wouldn't he? He'd cooperated in 1988. He'd answered their questions then. He probably assumed this was just another routine review of an old case, the kind of thing that happens periodically when new investigators take over cold cases. He probably thought he was safe. After all, he'd been safe for 24 years. Here's the thing about lies, they require maintenance. When you tell the truth, you don't have to remember what you said, because it happened. It's fixed. Unchanging. Real. The details stay consistent because they're not details you invented, they're things you experienced. You might forget small aspects of an event, but the core of it remains stable in your memory. But when you lie, especially about something significant, you have to keep track of the story. You have to remember not just what actually happened, but what you said happened. You have to make sure the details stay consistent across multiple tellings. You have to anticipate what questions might be asked and make sure your answers don't contradict things you've said before. It's exhausting, mentally, which is why people who lie frequently often get caught in simple contradictions. And over time, that becomes even harder. Memory fades for everyone, but it fades differently for true memories and false ones. True memories might lose detail, but their essential structure remains. False memories, the lies you've told yourself and others so many times that they feel real, those can shift and change without you even realizing it. The story you told 20 years ago might not match the story you tell today, not because you're lying now, but because you've forgotten the specifics of the lie you told back then. When investigators re-interviewed Kenneth Bartley in 2012, they weren't asking him to confess. Not at first. They were asking him to tell the story again. To walk through what he remembered from 1988. Where he'd been. What he'd seen. What Angela had said to him. How he'd felt when he learned she was missing, and then when he learned she was dead. They asked him to recount his movements on the day she disappeared. What time his shift had ended. Whether he'd seen Angela before leaving work. Where he'd gone afterward. Who he'd been with. What he'd done that evening. And this time, the story was different. Not dramatically. Not in ways that would be obvious to someone hearing it for the first time. Bartley didn't suddenly claim to have been in a different city or contradict himself in impossible ways. The changes were subtle. But different enough that when you compared his 2012 statements to what he'd said in 1988, the inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. He changed details about timing. In 1988, he'd said he left work around the same time as Angela. Now he said he'd left earlier, that he hadn't seen her before leaving. But other witnesses from 1988 had placed him at the facility at the same time Angela was leaving. So which version was true? He changed details about who he'd spoken to that evening. In 1988, he'd mentioned talking to a specific friend. Now he couldn't remember if he'd seen that friend or if it had been a different night. But phone records from 1988, reviewed now, showed no call to that friend. So had he been alone? And if so, why had he said otherwise? He changed details about his relationship with Angela. In 1988, he'd described her as just a coworker, someone I'd say hi to. Now, pressed harder, he admitted that they'd been friendlier than that they'd sometimes taken breaks together, that he'd maybe asked her out once but it was no big deal when she declined. Small shifts, each one explainable on its own, but together they formed a pattern. The pattern of someone who was trying to remember a lie they'd told decades ago and couldn't quite get it right. The investigators pressed him. Gently at first, then with more focus. They pointed out the inconsistencies. They asked him to explain them. They gave him opportunities to correct himself, to clarify, to provide a version of events that made sense. And slowly, under that pressure, the story began to collapse. Bartley tried to explain away the contradictions. He blamed the passage of time. He said he'd been confused back in 1988, that he hadn't remembered things clearly because he'd been in shock. He said that 24 years was a long time and nobody could be expected to remember everything perfectly. He offered new details, different explanations, alternate timelines. He tried to construct a narrative that would fit the evidence, would explain away the inconsistencies, would make him seem like nothing more than a confused witness with an imperfect memory. But none of it held together. The more he talked, the more obvious it became that he wasn't remembering, he was constructing. He was trying to build a story in real time that would satisfy the investigators, and he kept getting tangled in his own words. They asked him about his feelings toward Angela. Had he been attracted to her? Had he asked her out? He hesitated. Admitted, yes, okay, maybe he'd been interested. Maybe he'd asked her to get dinner once or twice. But she'd said no and he'd accepted that and moved on. It wasn't a big deal. These things happen. Had she seemed uncomfortable around him after that? He didn't think so. Maybe a little awkward, but nothing major. They'd still work together fine. But other witnesses, interviewed separately, remembered it differently. They remembered Angela mentioning that Bartley made her uncomfortable. That he didn't seem to understand that her no was final. That he'd find excuses to be near her, to engage her in conversation even when she was clearly trying to end it and move on. When the investigators confronted Bartley with these accounts, he became defensive. Said that people were misremembering, or exaggerating, or had gotten the wrong impression. Said that he'd never done anything inappropriate, never made Angela uncomfortable, never been anything but respectful. But his defensiveness was telling. Because innocent people don't get defensive when asked to explain inconsistencies. They get confused, maybe, or concerned that they're being misunderstood. But they don't get defensive, because they have nothing to defend. The interview went on for hours. The investigators kept circling back to the same points, asking the same questions in different ways, looking for the moment when Bartley's story would finally crack open completely. And then, faced with the reality that his lies were no longer sustainable, that the wall of trust and time that had protected him was finally crumbling, Kenneth Bartley admitted it. He'd killed her. Not all at once. Not in a dramatic confession that tied everything together neatly. The truth came out in pieces, reluctantly, each admission pulled from him like a tooth. Even now, even after 24 years, he couldn't quite bring himself to own what he'd done. He minimized. Made excuses. Tried to present himself as the victim of circumstances rather than the person who'd made a choice to take another person's life. But over the course of that interview, the broad strokes became clear. He'd been interested in Angela. More than interested, obsessed, in the way that some people become fixated on those who reject them. He'd asked her out multiple times. Each time, she'd said no. Politely at first, then more firmly. And then, when he still didn't take the hint, she'd been blunt. She wasn't interested. She didn't want to date him. She wanted him to leave her alone. For Bartley, that rejection was unbearable. It wasn't just that she didn't want him, it was that she'd made him feel small. Foolish. Like his interest was somehow wrong or pathetic. And he couldn't let it go. He'd replay their interactions in his mind, imagining what he should have said, what he could have done differently. He'd watch her at work, looking for signs that she might change her mind, that she might see him differently. But she never did. On the evening Angela disappeared, Bartley had seen her leaving work. He'd followed her. Not immediately, not obviously, but he'd gotten in his car and driven in the same direction, telling himself he just wanted to talk to her. To make her understand. To get her to see him the way he wanted to be seen. He'd caught up with her at some point, the exact location was never entirely clear in his telling, and may have been deliberately vague. He'd confronted her. Asked her, one more time, to give him a chance. To go out with him. To stop treating him like he was nothing. And once again, she'd said no. But this time, according to Bartley, she'd been angry. Fed up. She'd told him that he needed to leave her alone, that his behavior was inappropriate, that if he didn't stop she was going to report him. She'd made it clear, in no uncertain terms, that she wanted nothing to do with him and that his continued pursuit was unwelcome and unacceptable. For Bartley, that was the breaking point. The moment when his humiliation became rage. The moment when he stopped seeing Angela as a person and saw her only as the source of his pain. He'd grabbed her. According to his account, he'd only meant to stop her from walking away, to make her listen. But she'd fought back. Tried to get away from him. And in his rage, this is how he told it, as if the rage were something separate from himself, something that had possessed him rather than something he'd chosen, he'd strangled her. It wasn't premeditated, he insisted. It wasn't something he'd planned. He'd just snapped. Lost control. And afterward, when he'd realized what he'd done, he'd panicked. He'd hidden her body. Gone home. Tried to act normal. And when people started asking questions about Angela's disappearance, he'd lied. Told them he hadn't seen her. Had no idea what had happened. And then, when her body was found, he'd continued lying. Had expressed shock and sadness like everyone else. Had answered the investigators' questions with carefully constructed falsehoods designed to deflect suspicion away from himself. And for 24 years, it had worked. Listening to Bartley's confession, the investigators felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that they'd finally solved the case, finally gotten the truth. But also anger at how long it had taken, at how many years Angela's family had suffered without answers. And perhaps a measure of professional frustration that the initial investigation had missed him, had accepted his lies at face value, had let him walk away without serious scrutiny. But they also knew that they couldn't change the past. All they could do was move forward with the information they had now. Build a case. Make sure that this time, justice would be served. Kenneth Bartley was arrested in 2012 and charged with the murder of Angela Renee Sisk. The news spread through Cookeville like wildfire, not because people were shocked that the case had been solved, many had given up hope that it ever would be, but because of who had been arrested. Bartley wasn't a stranger. He wasn't some drifter who'd passed through town decades ago and disappeared into anonymity. He'd been part of the community. Someone people had known, worked with, seen around town for years. Many residents had probably crossed paths with him dozens of times since Angela's death without ever suspecting that he was responsible. And that realization was deeply unsettling. It forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil, about how easily it can hide among us, about the limits of our ability to recognize danger. Bartley hadn't looked like a killer. He hadn't acted like one, at least not in ways that were obvious to the people around him. He'd been, by most accounts, an ordinary person. Someone you wouldn't think twice about passing on the street. And that ordinariness was exactly what had allowed him to evade justice for so long. For Angela's family, the arrest brought a complex mixture of emotions that's difficult to put into words. Relief, certainly, that after more than 2 decades they finally had answers. finally knew what had happened to Angela and who was responsible. That validation mattered more than outsiders might understand. For years, people had speculated about Angela's death. Some had probably wondered, quietly, if she'd somehow been responsible for what happened to her. If she'd made bad choices, put herself in a dangerous situation, done something that had led to her death. The revelation that she'd been killed by someone she knew, someone who'd become violent when she rejected his advances, confirmed what her family had always believed, that Angela had done nothing wrong. That she'd been the victim of someone else's entitlement and rage. But relief was only part of what they felt. There was also anger. Deep, burning anger at Bartley for taking Angela from them. For robbing them of 24 years they could have had with her. For all the moments they'd missed, the holidays, the birthdays, the ordinary days that add up to a life. For the grandchildren Angela might have had, who would never exist now. For the person she could have become, the life she could have lived, if Bartley hadn't decided that his wounded ego mattered more than her existence. And there was anger at the system too, though perhaps more muted, more complicated. Anger that it had taken so long. That the initial investigation hadn't caught him. That he'd been free for 24 years while they'd suffered. It wasn't that they blamed the individual investigators, most of them had done their best with the tools and knowledge they had at the time. But the system had failed Angela. Had failed her family. And that failure had consequences that stretched across decades. There was also grief. Fresh grief that felt raw and immediate, as if Angela had just died all over again. The arrest reopened wounds that had never fully healed but had at least scarred over enough to make daily life possible. Now everything hurt again. The loss felt new. The absence felt unbearable. And underneath all of that was a deep, aching sadness for all the years they'd spent not knowing. All the nights they'd lain awake wondering what had happened, imagining scenarios, torturing themselves with questions that had no answers. All the times they'd driven past places Angela had been and felt that hollow ache of missing her. All the moments when they'd heard a laugh that sounded like hers, or caught a glimpse of someone who looked like her, and felt hope leap in their chest before reality crashed back down. Those years couldn't be given back to them. The arrest didn't erase them or make them easier to bear. But it did give them something they'd been denied for more than 2 decades, the knowledge that someone was finally being held accountable. That Angela's death hadn't been forgotten. That her life mattered enough for people to keep fighting for justice, even when it seemed impossible. And that mattered more than words can express. The resolution of Marcus Webb's case sent ripples through Valdosta and through the broader community of people who'd known Marcus or been part of that quiet support group in the early 2000s. Stephen Garrett, who'd finally found the courage to come forward, told a reporter that he hoped Marcus's death might mean something. That maybe it would remind people of the cost of secrecy, of the violence that shame and fear could breed. He said the support group had existed because men like him and Marcus didn't feel safe being themselves. And that lack of safety had ultimately cost Marcus his life. The high school where Pritchard had worked released a statement expressing sympathy for Marcus's family. They noted that Pritchard had resigned in 2012 for personal reasons. They didn't elaborate on those reasons, but people could read between the lines. The weight of guilt had made it impossible for Pritchard to continue in a role where he was supposed to guide and mentor young people. For Detective Carla Hutchins, the case had been a lesson in assumptions. The original investigation in 2004 had been thorough in many ways, but it had operated within certain assumptions about Marcus's life. They'd looked for obvious motives: robbery, revenge, business disputes. They'd seen Marcus as a straight, working-class man whose murder must have stemmed from something visible, something that left clear evidence. They hadn't considered that the motive might be buried in a part of Marcus's life he'd kept deliberately hidden. And they hadn't considered it because in 2004, in South Georgia, asking about a victim's sexuality wasn't standard practice. It was seen as private, possibly irrelevant, maybe even invasive. But Marcus's sexuality had been deeply relevant. It had shaped his relationships, his sense of safety, his willingness to trust. And ultimately, it had gotten him killed, not because being gay made him vulnerable to random violence, but because being involved with someone who was closeted and terrified made him vulnerable to that specific person's fear. The case also revealed something about confession. Dennis Pritchard hadn't come forward because DNA evidence had identified him. He hadn't been caught because a witness came forward or because security footage surfaced. He'd confessed because he couldn't carry the secret anymore. Because Hutchins's renewed investigation had made him realize the truth was coming, and perhaps because 15 years of living with what he'd done had worn him down to the point where confession offered the only path to relief. There's something profoundly human about that. Guilt accumulates over time. Silence becomes its own kind of prison. Pritchard had walked away from that drainage ditch in June 2004 believing he'd protected himself, preserved his life. But what he'd actually done was sentenced himself to 15 years of waiting. Waiting for the knock on the door. Waiting for someone to ask the right question. Waiting for the moment when the lie would finally collapse. The Lowndes County Sheriff's Department updated its protocols after the case. They added questions about victims' personal lives, including sexual orientation and relationships, to their standard interview guidelines for homicide investigations. They trained detectives to approach such questions with sensitivity but to understand their potential relevance. It seemed obvious in retrospect. But in 2004, it hadn't been obvious. And that gap in understanding had allowed Marcus's killer to walk free for 15 years. Hutchins closed the case file in 2020, after Pritchard's sentencing. She made a note for any investigator who might review it in the future: ask about what isn't said. Look for what's been hidden. The truth doesn't always announce itself. Those words apply beyond Marcus's case. They apply to the dozens of cold cases still sitting in file rooms across Georgia and across the country. Cases where the evidence exists but hasn't been understood correctly. Cases where witnesses exist but haven't been asked the right questions. Cases where the solution is waiting, just beneath the surface, for someone to look at it from a different angle. Marcus Webb was 41 years old when he died. He worked hard. He paid his bills. He tried to build a life that made sense to him in a place that didn't always make room for people like him. He'd spent years being careful, being invisible, protecting not just himself but the people he cared about. And in the end, one of those people killed him for it. There's a bench now in one of Valdosta's small parks, placed there by a group of Marcus's former co-workers. It has a simple plaque, in memory of Marcus Webb, 1963 to 2004. He deserved better. People sit on that bench without knowing the story behind it. Children play nearby. Life continues, the way it always does, with the past present but not always visible. The case files on Dennis Pritchard's conviction note that he will be eligible for parole in 2035, when he's in his 70s. Whether he'll be granted parole remains to be seen. Whether he's genuinely remorseful or simply exhausted by the consequences of his actions is a question only he can answer honestly. In interviews after his sentencing, Pritchard said he thought about Marcus every day. He said he'd destroyed 2 lives that night, Marcus's and his own. He said if he could go back, he'd make different choices. He'd be honest about who he was. He'd accept the consequences of that honesty rather than resorting to violence. But he couldn't go back. None of us can. The past remains fixed, immutable, a weight we carry forward whether we want to or not. The people who stayed with this story until the very end are exactly the ones this channel exists for. You already understand why these stories matter. They matter because Marcus Webb mattered. Because every unsolved case represents a person who deserved better. Because time doesn't erase the truth, it just tests our commitment to finding it. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, like, and share this with someone you know who values stories like this. This case forces us to sit with uncomfortable questions. How many other cold cases remain unsolved not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because we haven't understood the lives of the victims well enough to know what we're looking at? How many files contain the answers, waiting for someone to read them with fresh eyes and fewer assumptions? Marcus's story matters not just because of how it ended, but because of what it reveals about the cost of silence. About the violence that fear can breed. About the way shame, both personal and societal, can create conditions where people feel trapped between being themselves and staying safe. In the 15 years between Marcus's death and Pritchard's confession, the world changed in some ways. Attitudes about sexuality shifted, at least in some places. Legal protections expanded. more people felt safe living openly. But in other ways, particularly in small communities, in places where reputation still matters deeply, where families and careers can be destroyed by revelation, in those places, not as much had changed as we might hope. And people are still dying because of it. Marcus Webb's murder wasn't a hate crime in the traditional sense. Pritchard didn't kill Marcus because he hated gay people. He killed Marcus because he hated the part of himself that Marcus represented. Because he was so terrified of his own truth that he chose murder over honesty. That distinction matters. It tells us something about where violence comes from, about the internal battles that can escalate into external harm. It reminds us that the most dangerous people aren't always the ones who hate us, but sometimes the ones who are wrestling with the same truths we are and can't accept them. Detective Carla Hutchins continued working cold cases after Marcus's case closed. She's solved several more since 2019. In an interview with a local paper, she said the work teaches you humility. That you learn how much you don't know, how much you assume, how easily the truth can hide in plain sight if you're not looking for it in the right way. She said Marcus's case taught her to question every assumption. To ask not just what the evidence shows, but what the evidence might be hiding. To understand that people's lives are more complex than they appear on the surface, and that complexity matters when you're trying to understand how they died. Years from now, when someone reviews this case file, they'll see a story of persistence. Of a detective who refused to accept that a case was unsolvable just because it had been unsolved for 15 years. Of a witness who finally found the courage to come forward despite the personal cost. Of a killer whose conscience wouldn't allow him to keep living a lie. But more than that, they'll see a story about Marcus Webb. About a man who tried to live honestly in a world that punished honesty. About someone who deserved love and safety and dignity, and got violence instead. Rest in peace, Marcus Webb. You deserved a life free from fear. You deserved to be yourself without consequence. You deserved better than to die on a summer night in 2004 because someone else was too afraid to live honestly. Your story matters. Not because of how you died, but because of how you lived, quietly, carefully, always protecting others even when it cost you everything. I'll see you in the next one.